Now let's talk about boosted trees, which is another ensemble learning method. So what's the big idea? We can use errors of our fitted tree to learn from past mistakes and to make better future predictions as we build our tree sequentially. So let's talk about this a little bit further. So what are we doing with a boosted tree? We are modifying the response variable in a sense at each stage. And so with every new tree, we update the labels by subtracting the sum of the previous tree's predictions multiplied by a certain learning rate. In this way, each tree will effectively be learning to correct the previous tree's mistake. So boosting is the process of building a larger additive decision tree by fitting a sequence of smaller trees. At each stage, the tree is grown on the scaled residuals of the previous stage, and the magnitude of the scaling is controlled by a parameter called the learning rate. Let's look at a visual to see what this looks like. We have our data, and then we fit our model, and then we were going to look at the errors in the model. So this ensemble is a collection of models that do not predict the real objective field of the ensemble, but rather the improvements needed for the function that computes this objective. So it starts with the assignment of some initial values to this function, and then it creates a model to predict which gradient will improve the function results the best. The next iteration considers both the initial values that were generated and these corrections at its original state. And it looks for the next gradient to improve the prediction function results even further. So it is continually looking at the errors and is trying to find ways to improve and minimize those errors that then further adjust the initial predictions made by the model. It stops when the prediction function results match the real values or the number of iterations reach a maximum or a given set limit. So it turns a weak learner into a strong learner through this entire process. There are two additional types of frameworks that use this type of approach, which are the ADA boost and then gradient boosting. They're similar in nature, where you're looking at the enhancement and the errors to try to improve the initial algorithm by evaluating the errors from each additive iteration. So let's look into another visual here that will further elaborate this. This visual looks at a random forest versus a boosted tree. On top, we have a random forest. We start with our initial data, and then we generate bootstrapped samples that are created randomly selected samples from the original data set with replacement, and then a decision tree is trained on each bootstrap sample. And then we randomly select a subset of features that are used in each tree. These are the random features selection component of it. And they will generate all these models, probably about 5 or more. And then we average the predictions from these models. And then that will be our overall prediction. As for the parameter optimization, tuning a partition model involves finding the best parameters used for building trees. And these parameters will be problem specific. Ultimately, the goal is to find the best prediction possible. And in this case, we are looking at boosted partition models. So some of the parameters for boosted partition model include the number of layers, the split per tree, their learning rate, the minimum size per split, row sampling rate, and the column sampling rate. So let's look at this a little bit further. The first one we will discuss is the number of layers. Boosting can overfit if B, the number of layers, is too large. Although this overfitting occurs very slowly if it occurs at all. A validation will be used to also select the optimal numbers of layers. Another one is splits per tree, which is shown by lowercase d. This group controls the complexity of the boosted ensemble. And this is interaction depth because D splits can involve at most D variables. The next one here is learning rate, signified with lambda. Learning rates close to 1 result in faster convergence of the tree, but we tend to have a problem with overfitting. Typical values are between 0.001 and 0.01. Smaller values for the learning rate will require a larger number of layers and slows the convergence of the model. So what are some of the advantages of this approach? It is highly efficient on both classification and regression tasks. It has more accurate predictions compared to a random forest, so the learning that takes place from the errors improves the prediction accuracy more than a random forest does. At least that is generally what you see in most of the problems. And it can handle a mixed type of features, and pre-processing is not needed. Some of the disadvantages are that it requires careful tuning of the hyperparameters, and it may overfit if too many trees are used. And finally, it can be sensitive to outliers as well.